Well, thanks for having me. I'm a neurologist, so I'm a clinician who sees patients with neurological conditions, and I'm a cognitive neurologist. That means I'm interested in people who might have worries or concerns about their memory, their language, perception, thinking in any way. I'm also a cognitive neuroscientist, which means that I'm interested in how the normal brain works. Attention, memory, language normally works in us, and we can learn an awful lot not only from healthy people but also from patients with brain disorders in understanding how our brains work. And the rest of the time I do some teaching.
I know you just said people with brain disorders, and when I was looking into what you do, I saw that even with Alzheimer's there's over 100 different sort of reasons why that can come about. And that was something which I learned, is that it's such a complex space. And I would love to hear what the sort of main disorders are.
So nearly, I think most people equate dementia with Alzheimer's disease, and that isn't the case. There are over 100 causes of dementia, of which Alzheimer's is the commonest. So for us, of course, when someone comes to see us, they don't come with a label, they come with some concerns and symptoms, and it's our job to see whether we can decode those symptoms, to see whether we can actually, from the story that someone's telling us, work out what might be going on with them. Because, as I say, there are many, many causes of dementia, but reassuringly, a third of the people who come to see us don't have dementia. They have concerns about their memory or their ability at work, performance in some sort of cognitive domain, which is not because they have a neurodegenerative condition, but rather because they have poor sleep, stress, anxiety, or depression. So it's really important to try and work out whether someone's got something which is progressive or something which can be relatively easy to treat and reverse.
In a lot of your work, you look into what the self is, and I would love to hear how you define that.
Yeah, so the book was initially just to think about how I could explain what brain science has come to at the moment. And the way I was going to do that was just to tell the stories of 7 really interesting people who came to see me with problems specifically about, let's say, their memory, their concepts, loss of empathy. But then I thought, actually, they are telling me something much bigger than just about the brain, and that the book might be interesting to people who don't normally want to read science books or want to read about the brain. Because what the stories are telling us really is about how the brain creates the self, our identities. And it seemed to me that it was a very good way to try and explain what neuroscience has to say about how brains create identities, our physical identities, our mental identities, but also our social identities. Because one of the aspects of brain disorders is that they not only affect someone's thinking in some way, but they also affect the way in which somebody interacts with people around them. And it's so easy to lose that social identity.
There was one case study which I heard you speak about in a podcast of a man in his 30s who came in to see you, who at first didn't have very obvious symptoms. I would love if you could share that story with the audience, because it gave me such an insight into what you do and how careful you have to listen to your patients in order to find out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, actually you've touched on a really important point, because although many people think neurologists, all they do is scan people, get brain scans to make diagnosis, it's actually very old-fashioned medicine, because scans can be extremely misleading. What we really want to do is to be able to listen, take the story, listen not only to the person who's concerned, but also to people around them. So I make it a real point to see either a family member or a friend who's come with the patient and see them alone, because sometimes, you know, you're not going to get the story properly unless you hear it from someone who knows the patient really well. And the patient you're talking about is a young man called David. He was in his 30s. And David had been an extremely sociable, gregarious person, highly productive in his work in finance. But unfortunately, he'd suffered a stroke, and he became a very different person afterwards. So although he recovered extremely quickly from the stroke, gone back to work within a week, he was extremely lacking in motivation. He couldn't be bothered to do anything. And his friends also noticed that he couldn't really be bothered to keep in touch with them. He didn't seem to be interested. And of course they worried that he'd become depressed because of the stroke, but actually what transpired was he wasn't depressed. Nevertheless, he wasn't very productive at work, so he got fired, and he was so lacking in motivation that he couldn't even be bothered to get unemployment benefit. So he couldn't pay the rent, and his friends thought, okay, well, come and stay with us. We'll look after you for a little while. But they soon became very, very pissed off because he did nothing. He did nothing all day. He waited for them to come home, didn't do anything at home, didn't do any of the domestic chores, didn't cook. He just waited for them to come home to cook for him. And eventually his GP wrote to us, and I can remember reading that letter thinking, what does the GP expect from us, you know? And the GP had said something like, this man who was really highly sociable has now become extremely boring. Could you look at him and see if there's anything you can do? And thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to turn somebody who's boring into somebody lively? But we sent him an appointment. Of course, he couldn't be bothered to turn up. And I had to phone him to get him to see me. And when he did turn up, he was in an extremely disheveled state. You know, he hadn't been looking after himself. He needed to be prompted to have a shower. And the one thing he wasn't, though, was depressed. He was quite happy with life. He didn't know what the fuss was about. And when I asked him, so why aren't you doing anything at home? What would you normally do if you were just sitting around at home? He said, well, I'd listen to some music. So why aren't you listening to some music? Oh, well, I'd have to put my music system together. How long would that take? 5 minutes, right? So for David, 5 minutes worth of effort was too much to get the reward of listening to some great music. And in a nutshell, that was what we finally realized the problem was. Nothing was incentivizing him to do anything. Nothing was sufficiently rewarding enough to do something. And he was telling us something really important about how we are motivated to act. Because in all of us, we're usually making some calculation about whether potential outcome, like coming here today, is actually going to be worth the physical effort, the monetary effort, the cognitive effort of coming along when you could be doing something else. Because we can't do everything at once, so we have to prioritize. We have to make some sort of what economists might call a neuroeconomic decision about whether this particular outcome is worth our physical effort. And of course, different people do this differently. So the people who aren't here obviously didn't think this was rewarding enough to come here, right? So we make different calculations. And for David, nothing was sufficiently rewarding. And it turned out when we looked at his brain scans, because those can be very useful, he didn't have just one stroke. He had 2 tiny little strokes, and they were deep in the brain in a region we call the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia have been around for over 360 million years. If you go back to the oldest vertebrate backboned animal, the lamprey, and I don't know if any of you know the lamprey, it's a kind of eel-like animal. It's an apex predator in rivers. You don't want to come across a lamprey. It has this sucker mouth, and it's been successful for 360 million years because it is so formidable. The lamprey has these basal ganglia, and in the basal ganglia, signals about motivation, like hunger, sex, feed through the basal ganglia to the action centers of the brain. So motivation to action works through the basal ganglia. And in David, it was the basal ganglia which had been affected by his strokes. So nothing in terms of motivation was getting through to action. And one thing we know about the basal ganglia, it's, as I said, something that's been evolutionarily conserved for millennia, is that dopamine is a fundamental chemical, a neurotransmitter, that's very important in how the basal ganglia acts. So in David, we actually used a drug that we already have that targets the dopamine system. And although it didn't seem to do anything at the beginning, 3 months later, this guy who was in a real state came back to see us, and I could not recognize him in the waiting room. You know, he'd had a haircut, shower, he had a suit on, he had a new job, and most compelling, he had a new girlfriend, which would have been absolutely impossible in the situation he'd been in before. He was meeting nobody. So he was a real lesson to us that you could extinguish motivation through these 2 tiny strokes that affected strategic locations in the brain, the basal ganglia, and you could actually restore it with a drug that we already have that targets the dopamine system in the brain. So we were able to really help David, but I think what he was instructive for us was how normal brains calculate whether something is motivating enough to make an action. And I mentioned that, you know, the book is really about identity. So his identity as a person changed when he had this stroke. But in addition, it wasn't just his sort of personal identity, it was his social identity, because the connections he had with people became very frail as a result of the stroke. The loss of motivation, and only the loss of motivation, led him to be a different person who seemed to be completely unapproachable to his friends. So that's, you know, one of the themes in the book is about how brains create identities.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that, because we've sort of touched with identity. You've now spoken about motivation and also memory. What are the other sort of key pillars which form our identities?
You know, I think most of us think personality and identity is so complex. It's very difficult to put your finger on. If someone's coming along saying, we can do this by thinking about the brain, maybe they're missing out on something. And I could completely understand that. You know, if we're saying we can understand everyone's personality by looking at their brains, that's a formidable thing to say. But what the book is trying to show is really that even fundamental aspects of cognitive function, like motivation, like perception, like attention, what we attend to, memory, language, our idea of concepts, how we empathize with other people. These things, although they seem really fundamental and something that we all have, they are absolutely key to building our identities, our personal identities, and the way we link with other people, social identity.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about also when your sort of reality changes and you either lose your memory through hallucination or through trauma, and how your memory can actually get stronger and come back again. Does that tend to happen with patients who get brain disorders? Is there always an arc back to who they are, or is it sort of managing?
I mean, it depends on what the problem is. So, you know, someone who comes to see us because they're worried about their memory, there could be many reasons why their memory is a problem. And as I said, one thing we have to do is to listen, to think about what else is going on in their lives. So things that can be reversed that affect your memory is your mood and your sleep. If you haven't slept properly, you're anxious about something that's really important in your life, your mood is low, and that's a chronic state. That can have an incredibly sort of deleterious effect on your memory function. Objective measures of memory will come out poorly. And of course, it might be that you are developing a neurodegenerative condition like Alzheimer's disease, and that's the reason your memory is slowly eroding. That could be the reason. To make life difficult, both of those things can be occurring. You might be developing Alzheimer's disease, but you might also be becoming depressed because you realize you're not doing so well as you used to, and that's having an impact. And the other thing that we've learned is memory isn't one thing. You know, when we normally talk about memory, most of us are talking about episodic memory, the things we remember in our lives, the episodes, what you did for breakfast yesterday, where were you, who did you do it with. Those things are an episode in your life, right, as well as many others before. But it turns out there is not only just episodic memory, but there's something we call semantic memory, which is looked after by a completely different part of the brain. And by semantic memory, we're talking about memory of knowledge, concepts that we have. We kind of take that for granted. So it's not memory of things that have happened, but memory of things that we've developed as a knowledge base. And some people can get selective loss of that kind of memory. So it's a complicated answer to your question, but it depends on what kind of memory problems there are and what might be causing it.
I'd love to come back to some themes in your book again, but just before that, I'd like to go in with a really basic question of, obviously, before meeting someone like you or growing up and everyone's talking about the brain, there's that left-right brain understanding. From your perspective, does that end up being quite a divisive part of your work or not?
No. I mean, humans are really interesting because we have the most lateralized brains. In other words, the left hemisphere is very different from the right hemisphere in some respects. The problem is, you know, the mythology that is in the media about what left and right brains do. The key thing for us is that 97% of humans, whether we're left or right-handed, have language mechanisms in the left hemisphere. And that's really quite a strong factor that is across cultures, as I said, whether you're left or right-handed or not. And that's a really important part of the difference between left and right hemisphere that you really don't find in other species. Language is such a fundamental importance. And it seems like language piggybacked on other skills that we might have developed for fine motor control, because we need fine motor control for this kind of speech. And perhaps that was one reason why that happened. The only other sort of species where there is such lateralization are in songbirds. They have this sort of hemispheric specialization too.
While we're in that sort of little realm of language, and while we have you here, and obviously your book is telling other people's stories, which has helped you learn, I would love for you to tell a little bit about the man you dealt with who was a rugby player who had a loss of understanding of the language he used every day. Yeah,
so he was this guy called Michael, very articulate, in his 60s, and he was worried that he was having difficulty finding the right word in conversation. And actually, as I spoke to him, I couldn't find anything wrong in the way he was speaking to me. He was very fluent, really very articulate, and I was beginning to think he was just someone who was a little bit anxious without there being any need to be. But then we got on to the topic of sport, and you know, one of the things that happens in conversations is you sometimes have to get to areas to bring out some important part of the symptoms. And Michael had played a lot of rugby when he was younger, and he still, you know, followed the rugby on the television. So I asked him, so which position did you play in? And he didn't know what position meant. He didn't understand that word. I could see that. So to follow that up, I said, well, did you play in the scrum or not? And he didn't understand what the word scrum meant. And that was when the penny began to drop in me that maybe he does have a problem here, because these are words that he should really be familiar with. So we talked about things in his life, and I could corroborate those with his wife later. And his episodic memory, his memory for things that has happened to him in his past, was excellent. He had a really good memory for the past. But his problem was what I was mentioning before, is this semantic memory, conceptual knowledge. And his wife had noticed that although Michael was a bit of a joker at home, he now wasn't telling any jokes. In fact, he was really having difficulty understanding the jokes that his grandson, his young grandson, would tell him. he couldn't really understand the joke. And if you think about a joke, it requires our understanding of concepts, of words, and often there's a twist in a joke, in the way that we use a word. And he couldn't really understand the words well enough to see that twist. And on more sort of elaborate testing, we found that that was really the problem. Although he'd come to us with a difficulty with word finding, his real issue was with the concepts that link to the word. So if we take the word table, right? You and I could be shown 1,000 different images of a table, and we would know what a table is. We have the concept of a table. It could be a dining table, it could be a gaming table, it could be it's completely huge series of tables we could look at, and we'd know what the concept of table was. Michael was having difficulty linking a word to the concepts associated with it. In 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there's a community who realize that they're losing their memory, but they're not losing their episodic memory, they're not losing their memory of what's happened to them. They are losing their memory of concepts. So they realize they're forgetting what a particular word really means. So one of them decides, I'm going to put a label on a table, I'll put table on it, and I'll put a label cow on a cow, and that way we can all remember what it is. But then he realizes that actually even the label won't do it, because the label doesn't tell me the concepts that are associated with that label. So, table doesn't mean anything unless I understand what table is all about. And of course, those are concrete words, but abstract terms like embarrassment or humor, these have got a whole bunch of concepts associated with them. And that was what his problem with word finding was. It wasn't really finding the word, it was finding the concepts related to the word.
And in his case, was there a way that you could treat him, or was it just sort of recognizing the issue?
Yeah, unfortunately, unlike David, there wasn't something we could use in him. But, I also think there are lots of reasons to be positive about brain disorders. We're really in the infancy of understanding many of these conditions. And there are drugs that can be used for symptomatic treatment in some conditions, trying to improve the symptoms. There are new techniques, including neurosurgery or deep brain stimulation, stimulating focal parts of the circuits that might be important for a particular brain function. And when that kind of stuff started, it started first of all for Parkinson's disease about 30 years ago. I was a bit sort of concerned about the whole thing, thinking, why are we putting people through this sort of extreme form of surgery to stimulate their brains? But it's turned out to be a remarkably successful procedure in many patients. And I think what we have to realize is some of these new developments take time. And 10 years, 20 years is actually not a lot of time in our understanding of brains and how they function.
Like I said, I'd love to come back to your book a bit, because one of the main sort of themes is belonging. And what has this got to do with the self?
Well, as I was mentioning with David, he no longer seemed to belong to his social group. In Michael's case, the guy with the semantic memory problems, he also started to lose his friends because they couldn't have the kind of conversations they had with him. They couldn't have the jokes, the humor. And so one of the problems associated with brain disorders is not just the effect they have on a brain function, it's the effect that they can have in terms of how you link with people around you, your social identity, how you belong in a community. And so one other theme in the book, which is the backdrop in the book, is it's actually set in London in a particular time, in a decade. And it's set in modern-day London with multicultural elements to the backdrop. Because I think one of the interesting things for me that emerged is how easy it might be to unbelong if you get a brain disorder. But that got me thinking about how do you come to belong in the first place? You know, I was a child here who moved to London in the 60s as a migrant, and I can remember feeling it was a very disorienting experience, feeling completely out of my depth in so many ways, but it took an awful long time to get a feeling of belonging. And if you think about it, to get that, you need your brains to get you there, because you need to understand how things work. What is the sense of humour in the community that you've just parachuted yourself into? What are the things, what are the rituals? Because, you know, humans are so tribal. How do I get into this tribe? And one of the things I realised at about the age of 10 was, at that time I was going to write my great novel. And I thought, why write it? You can just dictate it. And my dad had one of these old reel-to-reel tape recorders. So I thought, I'll just dictate this novel, that'll be done. And I dictated about a paragraph and thought, I better listen to this. Played it back, and I thought, who's the guy with the Indian accent? And I realized that one reason I wasn't belonging was because I didn't speak in the way that other people spoke. And that was in, you know, at one point that was in inner city London, another point it was in the city Birmingham. But that provoked me into listening to the BBC World Service, which has led to this voice. I just need to get more regional now.
This is sort of a slightly off-piece question, but quite early in your book you mentioned Marvin Minsky, and I thought it was interesting to bring in someone with a background in artificial intelligence. With everyone sort of now, I mean, I shorten checking ChatGPT to asking chat, which I'm really embarrassed about. But I would love to know, can AI be a self, in your opinion? Yeah,
so Marvin Minsky was one of the pioneers of AI, and he was around at MIT in the 80s, late 80s. I just happened to be there at that time. And he'd written this book, which he called The Society of Mind. And his argument was that actually what we think of as consciousness and the self is really simply the emergent properties of all these brain functions we've been talking about: attention, perception, memory, language, whatever it is. It's simply that emergent property which we call the self. And of course AI has moved a lot further since then. So can AI have a self? I think then that depends on our definition of the self. What would we call the self? And, you know, of course, philosophers have been focused on this for decades, centuries. So, you know, one way to begin might be to say, well, you know, you and I are different selves because we occupy different bodies, and we occupy different bodies in time, so that gives continuity to yourself and myself. But, you know, someone like John Locke would have said, but imagine we could do a thought experiment. Imagine that your consciousness could be swapped into my body, and vice versa, right? Who would we call Rosie then, and who would we call Masud? And most people say, well, you know, there is Masud, because that's where his consciousness is, and this is where Rosie is, right? Because it's not the body, it's the consciousness that defines somebody. And you might take it a little bit further and say it's not just consciousness in that sort of first-person perspective, like having agency over the actions we do and experiences of what we experience, like pain or pleasure. We need more than that. We need mental continuity over time. Just as we need physical continuity over time, the bodies we occupy, we also need mental continuity over time to define the self. And finally, some people might say we need social identity to define the self. So if we use that as our sort of litmus test for could AI be a self, I don't think AI passes those tests currently. But theoretically, if it could pass those tests, you know, physical continuity over time, mental continuity over time, and some sort of social identity over time, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say it couldn't be a self. So theoretically, it could be a self, but I don't think it is now.